Hey, good evening. Joe Kent here. Wanted to talk with you real quick about two pieces of legislation that are working their way through the House and the Senate. Last night, the House passed the George Floyd police reform bill. This is a radical bill that does nothing but tie into a false narrative that our police are systemically racist and that the police are killing young men and women of color at a disproportionate rate. That's completely false. So what this bill does is three radical things that greatly hurts our law enforcement. So first is it limits police officers' ability to exercise qualified immunity. What qualified immunity is a protection that police officers have that prevents them from being sued in a civilian court while they are on duty and performing their duties as a law enforcement officer to protect the community. So now police officers have to worry about the people that they are interacting with suing them in civilian court. This is going to cause our men and women in law enforcement to have to obtain personal liability insurance and, worst case, lawyers in a civilian court. Overall, this is going to make our police officers think twice about going and doing their jobs, answering calls, being proactive. They're going to have this thought in the back of their head, this very real thought that they could be sued for any little infraction or misperception or bad interaction they have with the public. So this is not going to reward proactive policing whatsoever. Second thing in this bill that's very dangerous is the restrictions that are being placed on restraints, physical restraints, and chokeholds. So what this is going to do is this is going to make police officers have to rely on lethal force or blunt force way more often than physically restraining someone. So police officers operate off of a escalation of force. So that starts with telling someone what to do. You know, put your hands up, lay on the ground, all that. If people don't comply, usually the police would physically restrain the person that's not complying with them. The physical restraint usually comes in the form of the police officer putting their hands on them and then using some form of a wrist lock, joint manipulation, and then in some cases, if the person is really non-compliant, a chokehold to temporarily restrict the air and blood flow to the head, making it so that that person becomes compliant. So if we take those tools away, we leave police officers with some very bad choices. So they can't physically restrain people anymore. Now they have to either use their baton or their extendable metal asp baton to use blunt force to gain submission from a suspect, or they have to go to something like a taser and then, worst case, a firearm. So the blunt force is a bad idea because we're going to end up really, really hurting people that otherwise could have been quickly put into a chokehold or another kind of a joint lock. On the other side of that is going to be lethal force is going to be used much more because the police are going to go from having to use their tools verbally, like, hey, get down on the ground, comply with what I'm saying, all the way to things escalating to the point where that police officer now has to pull out their weapon and use it. There's tasers. Tasers, I think, are highly ineffective. I've used tasers during my time in the military deployed, and tasers don't always work. Some people are amped up. Sometimes it's hard to get a good contact with the little contact point that you shoot somebody with, the electricity is supposed to flow through. They're just unreliable. I wouldn't trust my life with a taser. So now we have police officers that are going to be forced in this position where they can't use their hands anymore. So that they're going to be left with verbal, blunt force from a baton or a metal extendable, an asp, or right to lethal. So we've even tied the police hands behind their back even more with banning chokeholds and restraints. Third thing this radical bill does is it limits police officers' ability to conduct no-knock warrants. So a no-knock warrant is exactly what it sounds like. The police officers go to a residence where they have suspects and they don't knock on the door. They just gain entry to the door somehow and then they go in. And the idea there is that you're giving the police the element of surprise so that the people that they're going to arrest don't have time to get their weapons. So this is usually used in drug cases. So the legislation that was passed last night specifically addresses drug cases. So we can't use no-knock warrants anymore to go after drug dealers. The vast majority of drug dealers are armed because the drug business is dangerous by nature. Drug dealers kill each other all the time. So most of these guys are armed. There's a reason why police do no-knock warrants, and that is to save lives. They are getting in the building before people can get to their guns, preventing the gunfight. So now the police are going to have to essentially stand outside the door in a very vulnerable point, not knowing what's going on the other side, and announce their presence. I don't see any reason why we're doing this other than making police officers wary of going out and serving these no-knock warrants. So this bill is extremely radical. It ties into that narrative that only further divides us. And again, this narrative is not based on any facts. Police that act poorly are handled swiftly, and they're handled in the court of law. There's a process for all of this. And the police officers that we have in our communities are not out there systemically hunting down African Americans or people of color. The facts just do not support that false narrative. But the Democrats are pushing it because they want to keep racial tensions high. They want to keep these riots going, and they want to tie the hands behind our men and women in law enforcement and overall make our communities less safe. Second piece of legislation that right now is in committee in the House is H.R. 127. H.R. 127 is a radical gun control bill. This bill will call for the registration of every single firearm, many firearm accessories. It will limit high-capacity magazines, and it will also take away a lot of the insurance protections from firearms companies. So now firearms companies can be held liable for criminal acts or accidents that happen with their firearms. It's the equivalent of telling the automotive industry like Ford or Chevy that if someone gets into an accident and hurts someone with one of their cars, that Ford or Chevy could then be sued. It's absolutely ridiculous. It's being done in an effort to make it more difficult for citizens to obtain firearms, either by making it too costly for firearm manufacturers to produce firearms, and then putting additional legislation on how hard it is to get a weapon. And then once you have a weapon, that you must register it with the government. Legally purchased firearms are already registered with the government. They're registered with the ATF at the federal level. This is just more steps that are being placed on individual firearm owners who are simply trying to exercise their Second Amendment rights. So when you combine these two bills together, the George Floyd Police Reform Bill and H.R. 127, you can see that the Democrats are trying to, again, keep racial tensions high, limit the ability of our men and women in law enforcement to keep our communities safe, and they're also going after the individual right to keep and bear arms, our sacred Second Amendment. So why are the Democrats doing this? What's their motivation? Their motivation is to keep, once again, everyone locked up, fearful of their neighbors, distrustful of the police, and disarmed. And if you are armed, they want to know exactly where you are. So this is very dark and I think very dangerous. I hope the Senate pushes back on all these. I don't have confidence that they will, just because of the fact that the Democrats are in charge of the Senate. So we need to prepare to fight back. We need to get people into office who will fight back against this radical legislation and stand up for our rights. I'm asking you to go forward for you here in the 3rd District and to do just that. So please go to joekentforcongress.com, read about my platforms, engage with me, send me an email, let me know what you're thinking, what matters to you. And if you can, please donate, because we need all the support that we can get to make the 3rd heard again and then to take DC back for the people. Thank you. Good night.